Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on Episode 6 of Cyberpunk, Edgerunners. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. So I feel like the start of this episode, it's sort of similar to the start of episode 4. I mean, granted, it is after the intro theme, where the first thing we see, there's a definite significance to it. It's definitely important, but it's not clear what precisely is going on. And we really only learn the significance of everything at a later date. I mean, I guess that already sort of gives it away. You know, that guy was very clearly main, and something's kind of up with him here, you know? He's having trouble. He's lost, fine motor control. He seems to be lost in thought a lot. And I guess just to make it worse, Dorio is suggesting that perhaps he ease up on the chrome a little bit. And you know, that would be a good suggestion, and indeed, that is sort of, the treatment for cyberpsychosis, you know? If you can't sort of separate yourself from all the chrome you're wired into, you know, get rid of the chrome. You know, that's not always an option in some cases, but I don't know, drastic times call for drastic measures. Now, I do think this episode is very interesting, but with the whole sudden onset of cyberpsychosis, I think it would have been better if there was maybe, a little bit more foreshadowing earlier. Like, little hints and things in previous episodes. Although that said, you know, this little bout of psychosis where he just sort of, slugs Kiwi while she's in the net, you know, that's a pretty good indication that things are bad. You know, I'm not, highly knowledgeable on Cyberpunk, but I do know that if you sort of mess with netrunners while they're busy in the net, you know, it's not good. I do believe that if you disconnect a netrunner while they're still netrunning, it's entirely possible that you just sort of, leave their consciousness or their soul or what have you in the net and you kill their physical body. And that's a good way to cause a lot of problems. So it's becoming very clear that there's all sort of trouble and dysfunction. You know, only Dorio is really giving everybody the scoop here, but she's not really telling everybody the full truth. And maybe she doesn't know, but she certainly suspects. Yeah, so this kind of puts everybody in a bit of an awkward spot, because Maine is basically the de facto leader. He's not going to want to listen to anybody. Least of all David, I'd imagine. Yeah, I mean, David does mean well, and he is trying to help, but I feel like there's really nothing he could say that would not cause problems, unfortunately. Yeah, seeing as how Maine's still fixated on that Sandevistan, I can't help but jump to the immediate conclusion that had he in fact chipped it in, that would have been it. He would be gone. Especially considering that, significant portions of his body already seem to be chrome and augmetic anyways. Alright, so the plot's thickening further. They need to do some sort of net running with Tanaka. But without Kiwi, the group is kind of hamstrung. Lucy can do the net running, but she's not as good as Kiwi is. And what's more, she seems really not to want to mess with Arasaka too much. And this is sort of indicative of, I guess, the rather poor position a lot of Edgerunners find themselves in, especially if they run afoul of one of the megacorps. Lucy, she's not willing to do the whole netrunner business, but, if David asks her to, she will. That sort of indicates that she really does care about him. So I guess Lucy's conditions are understandable, but it's starting to become clear that there's a definite schism in the group here. It's not like they were ever a super cohesive team, but whatever cohesion they had is swiftly going up in smoke. So there we have it again, Maine's having this hallucination, or this, I don't know, like a memory being lost in thought. And I do think it's kind of interesting that he's sort of imagining walking through the desert. Given what I know about Night City and where it is, I believe it's in, California, kind of near, the Nevada border, so it's, definitely pretty inhospitable, surrounded by desert and all that. So this is something else that's interesting. Lucy has what's called a deep dive port, and as I understand the concept, all netrunners have net decks, things by which they can access the internet. But a deep dive port allows a netrunner to access what's called the old net. And in Cyberpunk lore, as I understand it, the old net is basically the internet as we use it now. But sometime, in the lore of the tabletop game, a whole bunch of, AIs, literal demon AIs were unleashed onto the old internet, making it uninhabitable, shark-infested waters for netrunners. So only people with specialized deep dive ports can even access it. And, frankly, nobody should really want to. I don't know. Some of that's probably not entirely correct, I've done a bit of a cursory reading on some of the lore just because I think it's interesting. But unfortunately, it seems like Faraday's pushing from the other end, too. You know, if Maine weren't stressed out enough as it is, Faraday's certainly not helping things. And I guess when you get down to it, the fact that they kidnapped an Arasaka executive, you know, that should darn well, put everybody on high alert, you know. I'd imagine if Arasaka had even so much as an inkling of who's involved, things would be bad in rather short order. And speaking of bad here, it would seem as though that Lucy is actually probing Tanaka's mind, and given that he is now waking up, that's probably not good if Lucy's still in his head when he wakes up and is no longer unconscious. You know, I can only imagine it would be the same sort of thing as if she were just sort of unplugged while on a deep dive. So, if David letting this guy wake up weren't bad enough, Tanaka's starting to spill some beans, saying that, you know, he knows everything about what happened, and he was the one who wanted David readmitted, which sort of points back to that early scene about him saying, you know, like, oh wow, that guy used the Sandevistan? That's, pretty nifty and uncharacteristic of him. So Tanaka's trying to win him over by saying that, you know, David, you have unique potential, you know, you could get in Arasaka's good graces, but, you know, whether or not David has truly learned this lesson, the first rule of Night City is that you can't trust anybody. You know, for all he knows, Tanaka's just saying this so they don't end up killing him. And it's not necessarily the case that they will kill him, but, you know, considering the kind of shape he's in, that's, you know, it's not outside the realm of possibility. So, unfortunately, David's being rather trusting of the crew. Now, what's interesting here is that David is grouped in a sort of data set with the lieutenant colonel from the first episode and a bunch of other people. And, you know, they have all this information on him using the Sandevistan. So it seems like Arasaka really truly is looking into using him as, I don't know, like a guinea pig or something. You know, if this guy can chip all sorts of chrome, you know, we could make some real crazy stuff and test it out on him. Unfortunately, while David's having this conversation, he's functionally blowing the whole operation. You know, Tanaka's awake, and none of the rest of the gang is particularly stable, so I feel like this little indiscretion is only going to cause problems. So yeah, as it turns out, Tanaka died while Lucy was in the deep dive. Whether or not just jacking her out will kill her is unclear. I mean, I know it won't kill her, having watched this before, and it's pretty clear that she's not dead as a result of this, but I'm sort of incongruously reminded of removing a USB drive without ejecting it first. You know, it's not necessarily something that will corrupt your data, but the possibility is certainly there. And that's why you usually should just safely remove the device before disconnecting it. Alright, so things are starting to hit the fan. Tanaka's dead. The signal jammer they had is dead with him, meaning that the trauma team is swiftly en route. So I guess, fortunately for David, he's been given the task of getting Lucy out safely. You know, that's probably the safest thing for him to do, all things concerned. But I don't know, I feel like once Trauma Team realizes Tanaka's dead, they're just gonna bounce, cause, you know, what do they care about a dead client? So it's interesting that David says, you know, Tanaka short-circuited for some reason, you know. I get the feeling, and it would certainly fit in with Night City, that Tanaka was killed before he could spill some particularly juicy information. Perhaps what they want to do with David. But regardless of that, you know, Tanaka's dead, and excrement is rocketing fanwards, you know? Like, the Trauma Team's already showed up, and they're exchanging gunfire. And if it weren't just them, you know, it's the law enforcement, and shortly I can only assume that MaxTac will head over too, seeing as how they're dealing with some pretty heavily armed people. So once again, Lucy's displaying a fair degree of hesitance and caution. I guess some of that is really prudence, but, you know, the idea is Maine and Dorio told us to wait here, so we'll wait here for them. You know, if they slip out another exit and get here, then we'll be waiting on you, and that's bad. David is, I guess, naturally drawn to helping his friends, even if this would be ostensibly suicidal. You know, I'm wondering if this is perhaps an expression of Lucy's ulterior motive, that she just, you know, wants to be with David and, I guess, live out her dream, go to the moon, do all that fun stuff with him, because, you know, that would make the whole thing better. And it seems like she is sort of going out of her way to try and protect David, especially given what she saw. Now, I do think David's being a bit unfair to her, you know. He said, you know, aren't you going to say you believe in me? But then he didn't really give her the opportunity to actually say that. You know, it would have been nice, but what can you do? David, he's all about going fast, you know. He doesn't have time to think. So if the situation weren't bad enough, it seems like Maine is really sort of devolving and slipping into cyberpsychosis. It's rather unfortunate considering that it's not exactly an ideal time when you're in the middle of a firefight like this. I mean, granted, neither Maine nor Dorio has been shot yet, but I can only imagine it's a matter of time. Yeah, well, there we have it, you know. A couple shots to the head. If that doesn't do it, then, well, I don't know. So at this point, you know, there is no good outcome, really. Dorio's dead. Maine has decided that basically none of these people can be allowed to live for what they've done. And David's really too late to stop any of this bloodshed. I guess the worst part is that Maine is now somewhat lucid, and he's realizing that a lot of this is, for all intents and purposes, his fault, you know. If he had maybe just sort of like removed some of his crumb, just chilled for a while, maybe he wouldn't be so off the deep end now. Man, I like that only when Tanaka is splattered across the wall does the Trauma Team finally confirm that hey, the client's dead now. You know, I appreciate that you can't exactly take someone's pulse if their body is out of reach, but, you know, I think it's a reasonable assumption to make that he's probably not alive given his condition. You know, given the flesh wound on the back of his neck, sort of in the vicinity of the brainstem. You know? Like, I understand that assuming will likely get you in trouble with your boss. So this is where things get really bad. You know, Maine is lost. He's not who he was anymore, and MaxTac is inbound. So Lucy's saying he's just totally cyber psycho. But he is still kind of lucid now. And I guess it makes sense, you know. Dorio's dead. He has to give her something of a send-off, but I guess it's nice in a way. You know, he knows that psychosis is not something he can escape, and that MaxTac is on the way. You know, he could try and fight his way out, but it's already kind of futile, so you might as well go out on your own terms. To David's credit, he's willing to fight to the death, but it's more of a waste than anything, you know. He's so young and he has presumably some kind of life ahead of him, so, you know, dying now would be more of a senseless waste than anything else, even if the gesture is nice. You know, I would almost call out a scene like this for being cheap and lazy, just focusing on essentially a still shot. But I think in this case, it makes everything more tense as opposed to something like that one scene in Evangelion where Unit 01 is holding up Kawaru and Shinji's deciding whether or not he's going to crush him. And this scene was also significantly shorter, too. Now, you know, normally I don't always like this sort of like still shot showcasing the destruction of, you know, an explosion or something like that, but I think in this instance, I think it serves to make it a bit more dramatic. Now, I do have to feel for Lucy here. You know, she's trying to call David. Obviously, you know, he's not going to pick up at a time like this, but from her perspective, it would seem as though he's dead. It's not the case as things turn out, but, you know, I can't really imagine that David is much better than dead. So in a real twisted kind of way, like that start of episode 5, you know, at least David got those arms, you know. Maine kicked the bucket and said he could have them. You know, it's definitely not the circumstances he would want, but, you know, this is Night City. Only bad things happen here. Alright, well, that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.